Okay, so when we're putting it all together then, when we're talking more about step 3, what we're then saying is that the marginal rate of substitution is equal to negative MUX over MUY. The marginal utility or additional utility from getting good X over the marginal utility or the additional utility that comes from consuming good Y. That's my indifference curve slope. And then we have what the textbook calls the market rate of substitution, or what I call the negative price ratio. That's our slope of the budget constraint. Equilibrium is where negative MUX over MUY is equal to negative PX over PY. Cross multiply, rearrange the terms, and what you see is MUX over PX equaling MUY over PY. That's meaningful because what that essentially says is that at the equilibrium, the marginal utility per dollar spent is going to be equal. In other words, if something is 10 times as expensive, it better generate 10 times as much utility. Now, what do we see here as we go through this further here? What we see is that if they're not at equilibrium, it would be possible for them to increase their total utility. What that's essentially saying, these kind of lines right here, what essentially it's saying is that, what if I was at A? The problem with A is that I'm consuming too much of Y and not enough X. If I just readjust things, I can spend A and B represent spending the same amount of money, but by rearranging my consumption patterns, I can get more utility. And then what we need to look at then is how does what a person buys, how does that change based on how the price changes and the income changes? In other words, what we want to start to do is we want to start to derive the demand curve. Well, the easy ones would be what happens to the demand curve essentially, or the budget constraint and indifference curve when we change the price. What we know happens, let's just skip to the graph here. What we know happens is that the budget constraint line pivots outward. As it pivots outward, you'll notice that I consume more. Let's draw kind of a graph that explains this a little bit more and the consequences of this. I'm just going to recreate what was just on that slide. So price of good X was falling. That caused my budget constraint line to pivot outwards. But now I'm consuming more. What if I then change my graph? So instead of looking at good Y and good X, what if I graph out the price of good X and the quantity of good X? So the quantity is staying the same as this here because this is quantity of good X. This is going to be a lower price. So right in the drop-down graph, this was the quantity of X I consumed when the price was this amount. The price fell, right? That pivots out the budget constraint, and now I drop it down further because the price has fallen. Connect the dots, and you've got the demand curve. That's how we graphically derive the demand curve. This is a pretty cool picture. This is essentially what you would have started to learn in principles, where you just had to listen to me or listen to whoever you had for principles say, the demand curve is downward sloping. It is because I say so. Well, it's also true. And we can see that from the budget constraint and indifference curve line, that that's true. That as I lower the price of good X, it pivots out the budget constraint. If we then look at those lines of tangency after the change in the price of good X, A and B, if I regraph it again with the price of good X now and the quantity of good X, so the X-axis is the same here. The only thing I'm changing is the Y-axis from quantity of good Y to now price of good X. And now I've got that change. And that's what you see here, but with less excitement than what I just said. It's so much cooler. What I wrote is so much cooler than this. This looks pretty cut and dry. Okay. We could also change the income levels as well, not surprisingly. What do we know from changing the income levels? We know that it matters whether it is a normal good or inferior good. What do we know is true? What we know is true is that if I graph this out, what we see is that the price ratio did not change. But that income increased. If we do the drop-down graph, we have the price not changing. And there we see the demand curve shifting out. Shifting out because the income went up and this was a normal good. Now I'd go in the opposite direction if it was an inferior good where I actually wouldn't buy as much. Any of that excitement of what we're seeing here is just represented in a much drier sense on this picture right here. More income, shifts out, pivots outward, not pivots, shifts outward, parallel shifts outward the budget constraint line, and I'm now on a higher indifference curve after that income change. Now, what we can do within each demand curve then is we can understand two things going on. There's both a substitution effect and an income effect along the demand curve. And you can see that in the budget constraint. So here's what we're saying. You'll remember from principles that when I go from A to B, there's an increase in the quantity of good X. And that the increase in the quantity of good X comes from two things happening. The substitution effect and the income effect. As the price of X is falling, I both buy more X because it's cheaper relative to other goods, and I buy more of X because I feel richer. So it's cheaper relative to other goods, and I feel richer. And so I buy more. Now, what the next picture then shows, or next slide then shows, is that we can also understand that then in terms of the budget constraints and indifference curves. So here's what we do. Let's start at point A. That's my initial point of equilibrium. And then what we say is that, what if we reduce the price? What if we reduce the price of good X? Right? That what we're then saying here is, as we start to compare point A and point C, is that what I could understand this as being is that ultimately I go from point I guess I go from point A to point C. In this case, it looks like there's an error here on this slide, which is why I'm kind of pausing here a bit from time to time. There's an error here on this slide. You should ask for some money back from the publisher. Let me redraw this slide, because it's just wrong. That is slide 23. Guess this is why you pay the good money, right? Someone to correct the mistakes of others. Okay. Let's start here. A is my initial equilibrium. I think we can all agree to that. That would be the point of tangency between my budget constraint line and my indifference curve. Let's call it U1. Then let's say that the price falls. Price falling, price of good X, I should say. If the price of good X is falling, that will pivot out my budget constraint. I think we're all still fine with that. Which would create for us ultimately a new indifference curve and a new point of tangency. What we're trying to do in slide 23, though, is describe the movement from A to C as being composed of two parts, the income effect and the substitution effect. Let's start first with the income effect. What the income effect says is, let's draw a line that is parallel to the original, let's draw a line that's parallel to the original, repeat that again. Let's draw a line that's parallel to the revised budget constraint line. So the red line is my revised budget constraint line, what we had after the change in the price of good X. Well, let's take this, if this had been a straight line, let's make it a straight line here. Okay, so there's my straight line, my red line, my new budget constraint line after I lowered the price of good X. Let's parallel shift it inward until it just touches the original indifference curve. Let's call that point B. So what we're saying here is that let's keep the same price ratio as our new budget constraint line, but let's not allow ourselves to be any happier. And then finally what we say is, let us let ourselves be more happy. It creates then the division between, when we look at what's right on this slide, our income effect and substitution effect. That the income effect right means for us if we look back on the previous slide here, our income effect means for us how am I reallocating my income now that I feel richer and then what happens when I allow myself to be happier? Okay. Let me see where I am at in terms of time, so let me pause it here for a second. Okay, so I should have said with this, as I'm just thinking about this here, that you put these two together, and that's the total effect that we are seeing, with the income effect and the substitution effect. So I guess I should say this. What is the error? What is the error? Can you identify the error here? Actually, you know what? I mean, my explanation is absolutely correct. Perhaps I'm just having problems understanding the author's use of symbols. Maybe that's my problem. Yeah, that's my problem. Okay. Sorry, authors. You're not incorrect. You're just bad explainers. I read this and I thought, okay, they're reducing the price of good X, right? I mean, that's what it seemed to me. I guess I could have read the line. I guess the math side of me is just attracted to this and I didn't care what the words were. Not sure how this is not in conflict with this, but whatever. Looks like what they're drawing here. This would essentially be the picture of what it looks like when the price goes up. Same concepts are present. It now pivots inwards because the price is going up. But I still draw the parallel line and then capture my income effect and then allow myself to be on the higher indifference curve with the substitution effect. Okay. Let's talk about briefly here, and I guess in our remaining slides here, of what happens when I constrain choices. So we constrain choices. Let me give you a perfect example of this. My mother, I love my mother, and for birthdays and whatnot, she doesn't really know what to get me, but she knows where I shop. I shop at Amazon, I shop at eBay. And so she just gives me a gift certificate to those places, which is absolutely fine by me. Because I not only would spend what she gives me as the gift card level, but I would also spend more. But what if if my mother did the same thing for my sister? My sister who doesn't really buy that much online. The problem would be is that if she's just not a person that buys that much online, she wouldn't spend the entire gift card. She wouldn't use it. It's not useful. It'd be like giving me a gift certificate to, or a gift card to David's Bridal. I'm married, and I'm a man, so I don't really care about David's Bridal for wedding dresses. So it would be an unused gift card or gift certificate. Well, what does the gift card do for any store? Is it forces you to buy a certain amount. And then after that, you can start to make choices. Now, this isn't true of just gift certificates. Let's look at other things where this is a little bit more of a useful discussion. What about food stamps? Right, or now we don't really use food. We call it food stamps, but that's like the olden days, right? Let's just talk about it like the EBT card, or the basically the credit card like thing that we use for food benefits. That forces you to buy a certain amount, spend a certain amount of money as food, right? Because food stamps can only be used for food. But what you could be doing is forcing someone to consume more food than, let's say, buying medicine or paying for childcare, right? You're giving people food stamps and saying you have to consume a certain amount of food. Well, that's limiting, perhaps, right, for some people. And the problem that causes is that it causes then that it may be that I'm not at the optimal point. It may be the constraint may mean that the slopes are not going to be equal, perhaps. They are for me when I buy stuff at Amazon and eBay, but they wouldn't for my sister. Because the problem is that she doesn't face that choice to go to traditional stores. She would have to buy a certain amount. Which would mean that if she was on indifference curve 1, right, she's going to be forced to consume on this lower indifference curve. When if she could have reallocated her income, she may have chosen, right, something on a higher indifference curve. So, constraining choices is generally a bad idea because it forces then consumers to purchase, perhaps, in this case at point B, that they not be at optimal points on their constraints. Now, this isn't just true for how consumers make choices in terms of products that they're going to buy. This is also true in terms of how we make our leisure and labor decisions. That we can use the same form of analysis to understand why I work 8 hours a day and then rest for 16, and why others decide to work something less. Because their preferences are shaped in a particular way, and we can understand the same trade-off through this model. Okay. I already did this, and this is very unbeautiful. This is my drop-down picture. Why save it till the end? Okay. I hope that provides a little bit more of an explanation for Chapter 4. A pretty technical, economic technical chapter. But this is kind of the chapter. This and the next chapter are the reasons why this course is cross-listed with intermediate microeconomics. Okay, if you have questions about this, more detailed than what I just provided here, let me know, and I'll give you some links to some other videos I've made on this exact same topic.